Okay, hello to everybody out there. Just give us a few minutes before we get started. We have a large number of people signed up, so just want to make sure everybody gets in and logged in before we start. So go ahead and take it easy for a minute. We'll start. So hello, everybody out there. Just give us a few minutes to get started here. We're going to wait for everybody to sign in. We have a large amount of people, so just give us a few minutes here and we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everybody out there. Thanks for joining us on this virtual program from the Hudson Library and Historical Society. I'm Derek. I'm one of the reference librarians. One thing I would like to note is if you're in Ohio, you know how the weather can change. We joke about that, but it's a little windy out there. So hopefully if for whatever reason we go out there, we'll try and come back on. So just a little warning there. So with that being said, yes, it's April 1st, but it's this Egypt month. So this is our first program for that. So we have a lot of programs that have to do with Egypt, and go to our hudsonlibrary.org for that. Here's a couple you may be interested in. So April 8th, which is on a couple days from now, 10 a.m., we have a virtual Discover the Timeless Egypt at the Luxor Temple. So that'll be fun. That'll be, of course, we can't transport everybody, but if you log in virtually, you can see that. So remember that, April 8th. The 11th, a few days from that, we have our friends from the Cleveland Museum of Art, which is going to present, I had to write this down, Egypt Mania. It's going to talk about daily life in Egypt. So that's April 11th at 10 a.m. Then April 15th at 1 p.m., we have an author, historian Jane Draycott, and she's going to be talking about Cleopatra's daughter, from Roman prisoner to African queen. So if you wanted to see any of those wonderful programs, go to hudsonlibrary.org. We'd like to thank the Learned Owl, which is our local bookseller, for providing copies of this wonderful book here, The War That Made the Roman Empire. So if you want to purchase that book, which just went to paperback, please go to the link, which will be in the chat window. Also, speaking of questions, you may have some during the program or after. Don't worry, we'll have plenty of times for questions. So there's a little Q&A button at the very bottom of the screen. Go ahead, don't be shy, ask some wonderful questions. So let's introduce the author. We'd like to welcome back Barry Strauss. He's going to be talking about his latest book, The War That Made the Roman Empire, Antony, Cleopatra, Octavian, and at the Battle of Actium. So as I mentioned before, it just went to paperback in March, so congratulations to that. And a little bit about Barry. He has a BA from Cornell and a PhD from Yale. He's an antiquities scholar. He's a professor of history and classics at and also Bryce and Edith M. Bowman Professor in Humanistic, it's kind of a mouthful there, sorry. He studies at Cornell University. He's also visiting Corliss Dean Page Fellow at the Hoover Institution. And some of his previous books, as I mentioned, he's an antiquity scholar. He's the author of 10 Caesars, The Death of Caesar, The Spartacus War, Master of Command, and the Trojan War, which previously he talked to us about, and the Battle of Salamis. So with that, I'll introduce, or I'll let our author rather speak on his wonderful book. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Derek, for that very generous introduction. I'm really delighted to be here and looking forward to speaking to all of you today. The thought of Egypt in Ohio reminds me of the wonderful museum in Toledo, which has a fantastic collection of Egyptian antiquities. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen and if I can find it, and putting on my PowerPoint, which, yeah, here we are. Here's the PowerPoint. I'm going to share that. And now just great. So the war that made the Roman Empire, Actium 31 BC. Well, I'm not in Ohio. I'm actually speaking to you from Jerusalem, where I'm doing some research on my latest book, which is about Romans and Jews. But Jerusalem's really an appropriate place to be talking about the Battle of Actium, because it's a city that was visited by two of the major participants in the battle, by Antony. And there was a building named after Antony here, a fortress called Antonia. And by Marcus Agrippa, who was Octavian's right-hand man and Octavian's admiral. Israel or Palestine was visited by two of the other participants in the battle as well, by Octavian himself, who was there, as well as by Cleopatra, who also was here. And for that matter, Julius Caesar also passed through. So it's a place where we get a ringside seat on history. But today I'm not going to be talking about Jerusalem. I'm going to be talking about Egypt and Actium, based on the book that Derek just mentioned to you. So the Battle of Actium is one of the better known and more decisive battles in history. Here we see imagined in a Baroque era painting. The real battle looked a little bit different, but of course it excited people's imaginations, and for good reason, because there was so much at stake. The future of the Roman Empire, and whether the Roman Empire would look westward towards Italy or eastwards towards Egypt was the issue in the battle. But also it's a battle that excites our imagination because of the characters who were involved in it. Antony and Cleopatra, one of the most famous couples in history. Octavian, who was on his way to becoming the first Roman emperor. Augustus. Agrippa, a lesser known person, but a remarkable general and statesman, and all in the shadow of the man who had died less than 15 years before the battle, Julius Caesar, one of the most famous and infamous leaders in history. Actium itself is located on the northwestern coast of Greece. You can see it here. And we'll be coming back several times to this location. But just so you know, it's a battle of East versus West, but it doesn't take place in Egypt, and it doesn't take place in Italy. It takes place in Greece. Many of us know about the battle because of the play by Shakespeare, Antony and Cleopatra. The battle's kind of off stage in the play, but the relationship, the love affair, and the political relationship between Antony and Cleopatra are very much at the center of the play. Or perhaps our knowledge of it comes from not quite so elevated a source. It might come from the movies. Elizabeth Taylor, famously and infamously playing Cleopatra. And also, as I said, what's at stake in the battle is the future of Rome. And Rome always excites our imagination, the eternal city. So with that in mind, let me turn to the story. We have a timetable. We'll come back and back to the back again and again to the timetable in today's talk. It begins on the Ides of March, on March 15th, in the year 44 BC, with one of the most famous assassinations in history, the assassination of Julius Caesar. Caesar had become a dictator. He had conquered Rome in a civil war. He conquered the Roman Empire, showing himself to be one of the greatest generals as well as statesmen in history, but one whom many felt threatened the future of the Roman Republic. Here we see a coin in which he is hailed as an imperator, a victorious general. He had himself declared, he was named dictator in perpetuo, dictator for life. And that incited the conspiracy against him by the defenders of the Republic. And they assassinated Caesar in a meeting of the Roman Senate on the Ides of March, 44 BC, March 15th. Here we see an 18th century painting that imagines the deed. He was actually killed by a group of angry Roman senators. They could have hired a thug to do it, but instead they killed them themselves. They then proclaimed liberty. Freedom had returned to Rome. But in fact, what returned was chaos. After Caesar's death, the very future of the Roman state was a question mark. And what replaced Caesar was not a period of return or return to the liberty of the Republic, but rather a renewed period of civil war. A period of civil war that would only end with Actium and its aftermath. Here's one of the most famous coins, probably the most famous coin from the ancient world. It was issued by Brutus and Cassius two of the leaders among the conspiracy to kill Caesar. It's a coin that says Ides of March. You can see it written at the bottom, and it's pretty gruesome. It shows two daggers, which symbolize the daggers that were used to kill Caesar that had been smuggled into the Senate meeting, and in between them, a freedman's cap to suggest that Rome, like a freed slave, Romans like freed slaves, had been freed by the assassination of the Ides of March. Not quite. Well, what followed the Ides of March was some fighting. And then in November of the year 43, so a little over a year after the assassination, three men formed a conspiracy to dominate the Roman state, to rule the Roman state. And the conspiracy, or really not a conspiracy, I guess, because it was legally approved, much against the will of the Senate, is called the Second Triumvirate. These three men were Mark Antony, Gaius Octavius, and a third man named Marcus Lepidus, who quickly drops out, not nearly as powerful as the two leaders. So let's look at those two leading men. They divided the empire between them, with Octavius, or we'll call him Octavian, gaining most of the west, and Antony gaining most of the east. And here's what the Roman Empire looked like in this period. You can see that the Romans controlled almost all of the Mediterranean world. Some of the places like Egypt and Judea were still independent kingdoms, but by and large, the Romans controlled all of them. And here is Octavius, or Octavian. He was born Gaius Octavius. He was Julius Caesar's great nephew. He was the son of Caesar's sister's daughter. And he was, as a young man, he was very talented. He was only 18 when Caesar was assassinated, but Caesar had already seen in him a person of great potential. And when Caesar died, when his will was read, it turned out that he had named his young great nephew to be the heir of most of his fortune, and he had posthumously adopted him. So Gaius Octavius became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. We call him Octavian for the first part of his career. He was young, but he was very talented, very ambitious, a brilliant and Machiavellian statesman, a great persuader, a man of limitless ambition, and very decisive and very good at moving ahead. Here's Mark Antony. This coin doesn't do justice to what he looked like. Marcus Antonius. He was a man in his mid-40s at the time of Caesar's assassination. And unlike Octavian, who had not had any military experience, Mark Antony was one of Rome's most accomplished generals. He had fought with Caesar in his conquest of Gaul, and he'd also fought by Caesar's side in the civil war that followed the conquest of Gaul. He was one of the leading generals in Caesar's victories, both in Gaul and in the Civil War. And he was one of the two consuls, one of the two leading public officials in the Roman state at the time of Caesar's assassination. He felt that it was his right, that following Caesar as the leading man in Rome was what was owed to him. But he didn't calculate on Caesar adopting his great nephew. And he didn't calculate on Octavian's ability to get other Romans to fight for him and to rally to his side. So although he would have liked to have defeated Octavian and pushed him out of the picture, instead he is forced to accept Octavian and to join him in this triumvirate that rules the Roman state. But it's a very uneasy partnership. Rome has had a history, the Republic has suffered a history of these civil wars rivalries between two leading men, Marius and Sulla, Pompey and Caesar. And now the question was whether this truce between Antony and Octavian could possibly last. Well, the first thing they do the following year in 42 is they defeat the remaining assassins, Brutus and Cassius. They beat them in a battle in northeastern Greece at a place called Philippi. Antony is very much the hero of that battle. He plays the leading role in defeating Brutus and Cassius. Octavian is not a major figure there. He's there, but the credit goes to Antony. And after the battle, Antony goes to the east, while Octavian goes to the west. Now, you might think, gee, being based in Rome in Italy and Italy is the desirable position. That's what Octavian has. Antony is based in Athens and other places in the east. But actually, at the time, in 42 BC, the east is where the action is. It's the wealthiest part of the Roman world. It's the most populous part of the Roman world. It also is the gateway to the only rival empire that still exists after Rome had conquered all the rest, and that is Parthia, the Parthian Empire, the Persian Empire, essentially the Iranian state of this period in history. Julius Caesar, before he was assassinated, had planned an invasion, a war of conquest against the Parthians. And Antony now feels, great, I'm in the East, I can raise money, I can accomplish what Caesar had meant to do, I can carry out his unfinished business, and this will make me the first man in Rome. And so we come to the third member of the story, Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. This is a bust in the Vatican Museum, which most scholars would say is the most reliable Greco-Roman portrait of Cleopatra we have. There are about 18 or 20 busts of alleged busts of Cleopatra. There's also one in Berlin that most people think is quite accurate, but this one in the Vatican is considered to be the best. It's too bad that her nose is broken off, but you get the impression of a young woman, and she was young. She was only about 30 at the time, and she's quite attractive, as you can see. And here she looks very much like a Greek or a Roman. Indeed, she is descended from a Macedonian, from Ptolemy, one of Alexander the Great's generals. And there had been many Greeks in her family. Greek is her native language. It is also possible, however, that she was partly of Egyptian descent. The evidence is not decisive, but it certainly suggests that her mother was Egyptian and that her grandmother might have been Egyptian. It's also striking that of all the Ptolemies who ruled Egypt for now nearly 300 years, by the time Cleopatra becomes the queen of Egypt, she's the only one of all of them who ever spoke Egyptian, which is another reason to think that perhaps she was in part of Egyptian descent. We also know that one of her ancestors was Iranian. Also, though she's mostly of Greco-Macedonian descent, it could also be partly of Egyptian and certainly of Iranian descent as well. She's a fascinating figure. She's brilliant. She's ambitious. She's ruthless. She's a polyglot who speaks a number of ancient languages. And she presents herself to some of her subjects as I said, as a Greek or a Roman, but she's also capable of presenting herself as an Egyptian. Here we see Cleopatra on the left. This is the wall of the Temple of Hathor at Dendur in Egypt. And on the right is her son, or one of her sons, Caesarion. While Caesar was alive, he had met Cleopatra in Egypt in the year 48, and the two of them had an affair, and Cleopatra bore a son. She had the permission to name the son Ptolemy 15th Caesar, announcing that his father was Julius Caesar. Caesar never officially recognized Ptolemy as his son, but he didn't deny it either, and he allowed Cleopatra to use the name. He's generally known by his nickname, Caesarion, rather than as Ptolemy Caesar. And he grew up to be groomed to become Cleopatra's successor. Officially, they were the joint rulers of Egypt. But for all practical purposes, since he was a child, Cleopatra was the ruler of Egypt. She was the queen. Now, a year after the Battle of Philippi, in which Antony and Octavian became the rulers of the Roman world. Antony met Cleopatra in Turkey at the city of Tarsus. He'd met her before, but this was an official visit. He summoned her to Tarsus to defend herself against the charges that she had supported the assassins rather than supporting Octavian and Antony. And Tarsus is located here in what is now southern Turkey. And she made a grand entrance on a barge. Shakespeare describes it beautifully. And there she made a proposition to Antony. Not just let us be lovers, oh, that was part of the deal, but let us be partners. Now, what did Cleopatra have to offer besides her fabulous self? What she had to offer was the wealth of Egypt. And Egypt was quite simply the wealthiest place in the ancient world. It was what made it wealthy was the Nile River. The Nile overflowed its banks every year, and it created automatic irrigation that made Egypt one of the most fertile places in the Mediterranean. It made it one of the breadbaskets of the Mediterranean. And so the rulers of Egypt had amassed over the year an enormous fortune, which they had in Alexandria. In addition to that, they had a naval tradition. They were one of the great naval powers of the ancient world. And so she offered to Antony the chance to have access to this wealth, have access to this navy. And also, as her lover, Antony is following in the footsteps of Julius Caesar. Octavian has Caesar's name. He's Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. But Antony has Caesar's partner. He has Cleopatra. He accepts the deal. He goes to Alexandria, spends the winter there, begins his affair with Cleopatra, and the next year she gives birth to twins by Mark Antony, a boy and a girl. So they are partners together. And Cleopatra is helping to fund what Antony thinks is going to be the height of his career, a military campaign against the Parthian Empire, which you can see here to the east of the Roman Empire, whose borders are here in the Eastern Mediterranean. The fact that Antony is having an affair with Cleopatra does not stop him from engaging in a marriage. He had been married to a Roman woman who died conveniently. And as it happened, Octavian's sister had also recently been widowed. Antony was a widower. His sister, Octavia, was a widow. Antony and Octavian are almost at daggers drawn over who's going to be the top dog in the Roman world. And a tried and true Roman way of settling such disputes was through a political marriage. Here's a bust of Octavia. As you can see, she is quite attractive. And she and Antony marry in the autumn of the year 40 BC. And then they go off to Athens, which is Antony's headquarters in the east. She shortly afterwards becomes pregnant. She gives birth to a daughter. And a few years later, she gives birth to a second daughter. And her job is to reconcile her brother and her husband. And doing that, of course, she's competing with Antony's rather glamorous mistress, Cleopatra. And also she has to deal with the fact that Antony's ambitions might make him a more powerful person in Rome than her brother. And there's reason to think that her loyalties were split, that she's loyal to her husband, but she doesn't forget her birth family and doesn't forget her brother. Okay, so Antony ultimately leaves Octavia in Athens, and he goes off to invade the Parthian Empire in the year 36. But this Parthia turns out to be a very tough nut to crack. Here we see the Roman Empire again. Here you see the Parthian Empire in the east. And here is a map of the Parthian Empire. Actually, in the period we're talking about, which is about 60 years later than this map, the Parthians had lost control of this area to the west. And Antony is able, this area to the west had become under the control of the Kingdom of Armenia, which was a much bigger place in antiquity than the country Armenia is today. And with the help of the Armenians, Antony invaded this area of Media Atropatene, which is in what is nowadays northwestern Iran. It's a disaster. It doesn't go well at all. Antony is not prepared for how cunning the Parthians are. They're able to cut him off from his supply train, to cut off his supplies, and in particular to deprive him of the siege weapons that he had brought with him to try to take the capital of Atropatene, a city called Phraspa. We're not really sure precisely where Phraspa was located, but somewhere in northwestern Iran. And Antony is forced to fight his way back to the Mediterranean coast, his tail between his legs, having been suffered this great defeat by the Parthians. And he's forced to ask Cleopatra to meet him in what is today Syria, to bring him supplies, to bring what's left of his army home. It's estimated that he lost something like 25% of his army, which is huge losses. Unfortunately for Antony, around the same time in the year 36, things are looking up in the west for Octavian. He there has to face a very serious rival, the son of Julius Caesar's old enemy, Pompey the Great. His son is named Sextus Pompey, and Sextus Pompey has created a little bit of a naval empire in the west. He's based in Sicily. He also controls Sardinia and Corsica, and he builds a fleet which is able to raid the Italian coast and to cut off the supply of grain from Sicily, which in this period is the great breadbasket of Italy. And here you can see a coin that Sextus has minted. On one side, it's got a warship, which you can see very clearly here. Here you can see its ram. And on the other side, there's a portrait of his departed father, Pompey the Great, a trident, which is the symbol of Neptune. And here you can see it says Neptune, the god of the sea, and a dolphin, also showing how good Pompey is at naval warfare. And indeed, he is terrific at naval warfare. He has a navy. Octavian has nothing like it. And the only way that Octavian can defeat Sextus Pompey, and Octavian does not want to share power with Sextus, he wants to defeat him, is to build a new navy from scratch. It is a tall order. But fortunately for Octavian, his closest comrade, his boyhood friend, is an absolutely brilliant military commander, a great general and admiral named Marcus Agrippa. And here we see a portrait of Agrippa. I think this comes from the Pushkin Museum in St. Petersburg. And this portrait gives us an idea of just what a tough guy Agrippa was. As I said, a very successful general up to this point. And now he turns himself into an admiral. And he builds a new harbor, a new port in the Bay of Naples, and a new navy, which is able to take on Sextus Pompey's fleet. It's not an overnight thing, and they suffer many defeats and many setbacks until finally, in the year 36, a several-year campaign, he beats Agrippa's fleet, beats Sextus at two battles in particular, first at a place called Mylae, and second at a place called Naulochus, which is located in northern Sicily. Completely destroys the enemy fleet, and Sextus is forced to flee to the east, where he is then assassinated, probably on the order of Mark Antony. So in the same year that Antony suffered a big defeat in the east, Octavian has been very successful in the west and has crowned himself as the most successful naval commander with the help of Agrippa that Rome has. But that's not the end of the story, because Antony bounces back in the east. Let's see what the next slide is. He bounces back and he is able to take Armenia, which is probably, unfortunately, not really shown here. Oh, here it is, Armenia. In the year 34, he sends an army, he builds a new army. Armenia had betrayed him in his war against Parthia, and now he conquers Armenia, and he brings the king of Armenia in golden chains to Alexandria. By now, Cleopatra's had yet a third child by Antony, a second son. She has two sons and a daughter. And in a ceremony in Alexandria, Antony proclaims that his children by Cleopatra are all going to marry into major dynasties in the East, and they're going to become kings in the East to create a little empire for Antony, who's still a Roman and very much sees himself as a Roman, but he's also going to have his own little kingdom in the East. Well, Octavian realizes that Antony has now built up a new army, and Octavian's also concerned about the fleet that Antony is building up in Egypt. And so Octavian decides that it is time for him to make a move against Antony before Antony becomes too powerful, before Antony, for instance, goes back to Parthia. And so what Octavian does is he declares war in the year 32, but not on Antony. He declares war on Cleopatra. Why does he do that? He does it for political reasons. Octavian cannot easily declare war on Antony because Antony, like Octavian, is a Roman. For Octavian to declare war on Antony, he would be announcing a civil war. Civil war is very unpopular in Rome after the experience that the Romans have had in the preceding 2 decades. Furthermore, Octavian had sworn an oath after he defeated Sextus Pompey never to engage in civil war again. So instead, he declares war on Cleopatra. Cleopatra is a Roman ally, and technically, she's actually a Roman citizen. But that's not the main thing. She's a Roman ally, and Octavian says she's plotting against Rome. She is unmanning Mark Antony. She's using her feminine wiles and her Egyptian wiles to turn Antony into an enemy of Rome, and she must be stopped. This is, of course, complete slander, but Octavian uses it to mobilize public opinion against Antony and Cleopatra. It's not entirely successful, as we'll talk about in a moment. Okay, so Antony and Cleopatra have seen this coming, and together they have built a great navy. It is a fleet of 500 warships. It's very expensive to build a navy like this, but Egypt has the money to do it, and it also has the naval architects to allow them to build an excellent fleet, a state-of-the-art fleet. This fleet has a couple of things about it that are really important to note. First of all, the ships are built with reinforced prows. Ancient warships engaged in ramming. It's one of their most important tactics. And if you have a reinforced prow, that means you can ram the enemy head on, which not many ships can do. Because if you ram the enemy head on, there's a danger that your ram will be sheared off, that it won't survive the attack. But if you have a reinforced prow, you can do that. The other thing that's interesting about this fleet is that although most of the ships are standard size warships from this period, some of them are enormously large and heavy. And we'll see in a moment what the purpose of having these large and heavy ships are. It is a very substantial fleet. Now, Octavian and Agrippa have a substantial fleet as well, a fleet of about 400 warships, and it's a more experienced fleet than Antony and Cleopatra's warships. But it's nothing to be sneezed at, the fleet that Antony and Cleopatra have. They also have virtually unlimited money. Octavian doesn't have a whole lot of money. The only way for Octavian to have money is to raise taxes, which he does because war is expensive. And this is very unpopular in Italy, and it leads to dissent and to armed revolt against him. So Antony and Cleopatra are ready for this war. And how are they going to fight it? Well, are they going to sit in the defensive in the East? No, they're going to take the war to the West. And in the spring and summer and autumn of the year 32 BC, they take their fleet, they gather it at Ephesus here in Asia Minor and what's now the west coast of Turkey. Ephesus is south of Izmir. They sail first to Athens, and then they sail around to the west coast of Greece. And they end up deploying their fleet along the west coast of Greece. Actium is the main base, but they themselves decide they're going to headquarter themselves in the city of Patrae, modern Patras, in Western Greece. Okay, so what's the plan? How do they plan to win this war against Octavian? Well, I'll tell you the plan that I think they originally had in mind, and that's the plan that they don't carry out. The plan that they originally had in mind was to engage in a very risky activity, to sail across the Ionian Sea, probably here north of the island of Corcyra, and to attack a fortified city in southern Italy, either Tarentum, modern Taranto, or Brundisium, modern Brindisi. This was a tough nut to crack, but I'm convinced that this would have been the best way for them to win the war. And I also I'm convinced that that's what Julius Caesar would do. What would Caesar do? That was a question on the mind of all ancient generals in this period. And here's our friend Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was a master of risk-taking. He was addicted to risk-taking, but it was always strategic risk-taking, or so he thought, strategic risk-taking. He wouldn't just take any old risk, but rather he would think what might work. As you know, Caesar is famous for saying when he crossed the Rubicon, the die is cast. The die is cast, or in another version, let the dice fly high. Okay. I believe Caesar would have taken this fleet and attacked Brundisium. What's the problem with attacking Brundisium? Well, as you can see here, it is a really well fortified site. It is not easy to attack Brundisium. Not only does it have an inner harbor and walls, but it would have been defended as well by a boom, as it were, by a chain that's protecting Brundisium in the outer harbor. So how do you break through this? You break through it with the kind of warships that Antony and Cleopatra had, with a significant number, not a large number, probably maybe 30 out of their 500 ships, were these big, big, big ships that are capable of breaking through chains and attacking a walled city. On top of that, what they could do, which they'd actually, Antony had experience of this before, was landing a fleet further north in Italy and then having the army march to Brundisium. I think by bringing the war to Italy, they had the best chance of defeating Octavian and also getting a lot of support in Italy from people who didn't like Octavian's taxes and didn't like the way that Octavian threw his political weight around in Italy. Oddly enough, the remaining defenders of the Roman Republic were on the side of Antony. They saw Octavian as a usurper. They saw Antony rather as, if not the most loyal Republican in the world, at least a member of the Roman nobility. They saw him as one of us. Okay, but they don't carry out this plan, not at all. Instead, they decide to sit on the defensive in Western Greece and let the enemy come to them. Why? We don't know. Maybe Antony lost his nerve. Maybe he felt it was just too risky to cross an attack. And maybe he felt that it was too politically incorrect to attack Italy with the Queen of Egypt, his mistress, with him in his camp, and she was. And Cleopatra was with Antony in his camp in Western Greece. Some of his supporters had demanded that he send Cleopatra home. They said that she would be a huge propaganda demerit against Antony and would be used by Octavian against him, as indeed she was. But he couldn't send her home. For one thing, she was one of his most important allies, and you couldn't send an ally home. For another thing, she had the money. She controlled the money, and she had the money with her. And Antony couldn't very well take it from her. Even if he wanted to, he couldn't take it by force because she had 60 warships with her and a substantial army. And she had no intention of leaving because she feared that if she left, that there'd be a reconciliation between Octavian and Antony. Octavian was extremely sly and Machiavellian and very good at making deals. By the way, in the run-up to the Battle of Actium, Antony had divorced Octavia. we can talk in the Q&A if you're interested as to why he divorced Octavia. Naturally, Octavian used this as a propaganda assault on Antony, saying that Antony had been unmanned by Cleopatra and had given up his good Roman wife. But Cleopatra knew that people who were divorced could get remarried, and she was very worried about this. She wasn't leaving Antony. Another factor as to why Antony didn't invade Italy might be that Cleopatra felt that she wanted to cover all the bases, and she preferred to have her fleet in Western Greece, where she could make a quicker return to Egypt if necessary. So instead of attacking Italy, Antony and Cleopatra's plan is to stay on the defensive, let the enemy come to them, and then fight a battle. Julius Caesar would never have done this, not Mr. Strategic Risk. So the initiative now passes to Octavian, because although Antony and Cleopatra are not willing to take a risk, Octavian and Agrippa are. And in March of the year 31, they take their risk, they make their move, they engage in their assault on Methone. Let me tell you now what that's all about. And here's our friend Agrippa again. Agrippa takes a fleet, not so small, not so large, we don't know the number. I'm going to guess 100 warships. And in March, at the beginning of the sailing season, when it's still a little bit risky to sail, when the weather is up and down, as those of you in Ohio know very well, he takes his fleet of 100 ships and he crosses the Ionian Sea, perhaps from Tarentum, perhaps from Brundisium, and keeping far enough away from the Greek islands so that his fleet couldn't be seen. He heads south, not to Actium, but to this place, Methone, in the southwestern Peloponnesus. Let me explain why. Here you see Methone. It's in the southwestern Peloponnesus, as I said. It is an excellent harbor, and it is fortified. Methone is important because it is the most important single base in a chain. It's the most important single link in a chain that stretches back through the Greek islands to Crete, to Cyprus, to Syria, and to Egypt. This is a supply chain to feed Antony and Cleopatra's men. They can't be fed by the food in Greece. Why not? Because there's not enough food in Greece to feed them. Greece is a poor country. And so the supplies have to be brought in from the east. If you could take Methone, you can cut off that supply chain. The strategy that, and if you cut off the supply chain, you can starve the enemy army. And this is an old Roman advice that Agrippa is following. It's a great strategy, is to press the enemy more with famine than with a sword. Methone is defended by an African king, the king of Mauritania, Morocco, a man named Bogud. Or I should say by the former king of Mauritania. He's been deposed by an ally of Octavian because he supported Antony. He's a king without a kingdom. But he's a successful warrior. He had helped Caesar in his last battle of the Civil War. And so he's put in charge of the defense of Methone. He doesn't have any legions with him, though, and he probably doesn't have many ships. This is the man who is faced with a sudden, unexpected raid by Agrippa, a raid in large force, a raid in force in March of the year 31. Nobody saw it coming. Here's Mauritania, where he'd been the king of. And let's take another look at Methone. This is a really important moment, but it's not well documented. We only have a few sentences from our ancient sources. One is from Strabo, who wrote geography. And his geography book, he says that at Methone, Agrippa, during the War of Actium, after he'd taken the place by an attack from the sea, put to death Bogus, calls him Bogus rather than Bogud, the king of the Marusians, the Mauritanians, who belonged to the faction of Antony. So Agrippa came from the sea. Cassius Dio, a Roman historian writing around the year 200 of our era, says Agrippa captured Methone by storm and killed Bogud there. And then he uses Methone as a base to attack the merchant vessels that are coming to bring supplies to Antony and Cleopatra. And this disturbed Antony greatly. Another source, a book about vegetarian cuisine, Porphyry on abstinence, says that Bogus was king of the Marusians and killed by Agrippa at Methone. And finally, Orosius, a Christian writer writing around the year 400, says that Agrippa was sent ahead by Octavian and took many merchant ships loaded with grain and arms from Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor, and coming to Antony's support. And after crossing the Gulf of the Peloponnesus, we call it the Ionian Sea, he stormed the city of Methone, which had been fortified with a very strong garrison of supporters of Antony. So this is a startling moment in March of 31. When I was writing my book, I was teaching for a year at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. And many of my students were special forces, including Navy SEALs. And I asked them, how would you carry on an amphibious landing like this? How would you do it? And they had some very helpful ideas. They said that to take Methone, the best time to attack it would be at a night of a half moon. That's quarter moon in military parlance. And to attack it in the hours just before dawn, when the defenders would be at their sleepiest and would have their guard down. Furthermore, they suggested that Agrippa could have based his fleet on one of the islands off the coast. The island of Sapienza, that's a modern name, we don't know the ancient name, had a reputation in more recent times as a pirate's nest. It would have been a perfect place to bring his fleet, and then with the aid of somebody who knew the local waters, to attack the fort at Methone in the hours before dawn. At Methone, there was a strong fort. It hasn't been excavated, so we only know a little bit of what the ancient lay of the land was. But there's a beautiful Ottoman Venetian fort that's there today. If you ever have the chance to visit, I highly recommend it. And here you can see the island of Sapienza in the distance. So I imagine that Agrippa attacked in the pre-dawn hours one day in March of the year 31, a day when there was a half moon. And the raid was a complete success. He took possession of this crucial place and killed its leading defender, its commander, Bogus. He uses this now as a base to attack Antony and Cleopatra's supplies, place after place after place. And slowly, in the spring and summer of the year 31 BC, he starves Antony and Cleopatra out. Meanwhile, the supply chain, I said, is in big trouble. Meanwhile, Octavian has brought the rest of the fleet to Actium. Antony and Cleopatra got there first. They build a camp, camp here in the southern peninsula. You can see that Actium is at the entrance to the Gulf of Ambracia or Arta. There's a narrow entranceway, and they are able to dock their ships inside and protected in this gulf. It's an excellent place to have a harbor, and they make their camp here. Octavian is forced to make his camp about 5 miles away in the high ground at a place called Michalitsi. It's his modern Greek name. The fact that it's the high ground is an advantage. It's only got one major disadvantage, though. It doesn't have a good harbor. All it's got is this bay, the Bay of Gomeros, which is subjected to a lot of wind. Antony builds a second camp on the northern peninsula and tries to use it to force Octavian to come out and fight a land battle. Antony feels, and this is his strategy, that he will have the advantage in a land battle. He's a much more experienced general than Octavian, but Octavian's not a fool, and he knows it, and he refuses to come out and fight. Meanwhile, Agrippa and his fleet are taking place after place, and finally they take the island of Lucus, which is to the south, and gives Octavian access to another harbor, to a very fine harbor where he can keep his fleet. Anyhow, as the months pass by, Antony and Cleopatra's men get hungrier, and they start suffering from malaria because they're on ground where there are a lot of mosquitoes, and they begin to desert to Octavian, who refuses to come out and fight. And finally, by August, Antony and Cleopatra realize that they are in an impossible position. They need to leave Actium as soon as they can. and go back to Egypt and make that their base, or perhaps to go to Eastern Greece rather than going to Egypt and make that their base of somewhere in the Aegean or in Asia Minor, rather than continuing in this place where they have no supplies at Actium. But this is very controversial. There is a navy here and there's an army here, and some of the people in Antony's camp want to retreat by land by the army. But generally in the ancient world, sea travel was more reliable than land travel. And so they decide in the end that they're going to break out of Actium by sea. The most important thing they have with them is not their men, as important as they are, or their ships, as important as they are. It's rather the treasure, the Egyptian treasure, which Cleopatra has with her. And she feels that she will be best able to save it by going out at sea. At this point, Antony and Cleopatra are outnumbered by the enemy. Octavian has 400 ships, and Antony and Cleopatra are in such bad shape, and they have so little manpower, they're forced to burn some of their ships, and they're left with 230 ships. I'll talk in a moment about what their plan was and what happened that day. But first, just to give you an overview. So I said that Octavian's headquarters is here at this place called Mykolaizi. Afterwards, he builds an enormous victory monument here. It doesn't survive, but this is an artist's rendering of what it might have looked like. And one of the central things in the monument is he puts up the rams that he has captured from the enemy ships. It's part of his victory monument. You can visit it today, and I was there, and from there you can see a view of the whole harbor and the water outside of Actium in the mountains in the distance. It is a dominant position. So what is Antony and Cleopatra's plan? How do they plan to break out of this, the Gulf of Ambracia, and escape to Egypt? And here we see a coin that was issued not long before this. You see Antony there shown with a bull neck, as if this guy has worked out a lot. Probably in real life, he didn't look quite that imposing. And here's Cleopatra. She's an older woman at this point, and she's very much a queen. She's wearing a diadem, a ribbon of royalty, which they wore instead of a crown in the ancient world. Her hair has been very carefully coiffed. It takes a lot of money to do that, and she's wearing a lot of jewelry. She's not famously beautiful. She looks kind of masculine, but that may be the way she wanted her artist to portray her, because she knows that as a reigning queen, she's at a disadvantage in a sexist culture. So she wants people to think of her as having masculine characteristics. Here's another coin that they issued to pay their troops in the run-up to the Battle of Actium. You can see it shows a fleet, and on the other side it had the name of the legion, and they had 19 legions there, so many different coins. Here's Octavian, again, on the eve of the battle. And here is an early modern rendering of what Agrippa looked like. Here you can see him here. Okay, so the plan of the battle. Antony and Cleopatra's plan is to break out, to fight a breakout battle. They don't think they're going to be able to defeat the enemy's fleet, but they're willing to, if an opportunity arises, they're willing to try to ram the enemy's fleet using the one card they have left to play. Their ships, as I said, have these reinforced prows and have a certain advantage against the enemy. But there are only 230 of them as opposed to 400 ships in the enemy's camp. So they know they're at a disadvantage. So in the morning of the battle, what they do is they sail out of the Gulf and they line up their fleet along the shore from down here to up there, hugging the shore, staying close to the shore so that the enemy cannot outflank them. It cannot surround them. They're anchored by 2 points on the shore. Meanwhile, about a nautical mile away, Octavian and Agrippa have lined up their fleet. They don't want to get close to the enemy. Why not? Because if they get close to the enemy might be able to ram them using their more powerful ships. They know that if they stay far away, they will have the advantage that by the time the enemy rows out to ram them, Antony and Cleopatra, because they're short on manpower, will probably not be able to make the kind of thrust that they would have liked to have done. Meanwhile, there's another factor that we have to add to the equation to understand this battle, and that is the wind. The wind in this part of the world blows up in the afternoon, and it blows up from the northwest. If you're trying to escape to the south, as Antony and Cleopatra are, that's ideal. If the wind is blowing from the northwest, all you have to do is put up your sails, and you're going to go very quickly. There's only one problem. When ancient fleets fought naval battles, they did not normally bring their sails on board. They wanted to be nimble. They wanted to be quick. Having sails and the masts that hold them up are going to make your ships heavy. And yet Antony and Cleopatra on this occasion bring the masts and the sails onto the ship because they know that the likeliest outcome of this battle is that they're going to have to make their way quickly to the south. And they'll have an advantage of the enemy because they'll have their sails and the enemy ships doesn't. Okay, here is a warship from this period. You can see that it is meant to be a Roman ship in Egypt because you see the crocodile, which is the symbol of the ship. It gives us some idea of how ships fought in this period. Yes, they rammed the enemy, but also they had fighting men on deck. They had archers, they had slingers, they had catapults, and they had these portable towers that you could put together just on the eve of the battle, and you could have archers on there. So as the fleets would advance against each other, they would go in an anti-personnel attack, and then they would attempt to ram. Okay, so the battle begins, the fighting probably begins around noon. The ships the men go on the ships in the pre-dawn hours of September 2nd, 31 BC, when the days are still long. The fleets are deployed by around 10 a.m., and they wait until noon. Antony is waiting for the wind to begin to change, and that's when he launches his assault on Octavian and Agrippa's fleet. The assault fails. Because Octavian and Agrippa had kept their fleet far enough away, Antony is not able to deal a knockout blow by rowing really hard and ramming the enemy's ships. Instead, the two battle lines come into, they're grappling with each other. The actions on the right and left flanks. In the center, a gap opens up. And then around 2 in the afternoon, something really shocking happens. Cleopatra, who has a squadron of 60 Egyptian ships, suddenly sails through the gap and starts to flee. Now, this is an infamous moment if you know your Shakespeare. Shakespeare says that Cleopatra ran away like a frightened cow, and that ruined the battle for Antony. But I don't actually think that's what happened at all. I think this was the plan. The plan all along was that if Antony is not able to deliver a knockout blow, that Cleopatra should take her 60 ships and begin to flee. And they had to wait to the point in the afternoon when the wind was strong enough from the northwest, not too strong, not strong enough to stop them from moving, but just beginning to blow up. And that's the moment when Cleopatra would make her move. And so she does. Antony leaves his flagship and he joins Cleopatra. Cleopatra and 60 Egyptian ships and somewhere between 10 and 20 of Antony's Roman ships flee the scene of the battle. What happens to the rest of the ships? Well, they continue fighting against Octavian. They might not even know that Antony has fled, and they might be so angry at Octavian or feeling they'll take their chances against Octavian that they keep fighting. The fighting is so bitter that finally Octavian and Agrippa have no choice but to set fire to the enemy ships, which they do through flaming arrows. The ships are highly combustible, and there are, really gruesome scenes of people being killed in these fires before the battle is over. I want to show you another depiction, which may actually show the Battle of Actium. That comes from here in Israel. It's from a fortress of King Herod the Great, and it was probably painted to honor Agrippa on his visit there. Oh, I forget the year. It's maybe 15 years after the battle. It's a fresco. It's now in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, but it shows a warship that is it's bristling with armed fighters on deck. it could have been one of Antony or Cleopatra's ships because it's got the sail billowing. And in a description of the battle, the Aeneid by the poet Virgil, he talks about how Cleopatra's sails were billowing in the battle. So another picture of the battle. As I said, Cleopatra is blamed for what went wrong in the battle, but I think she is very unfairly blamed. In fact, I think her actions in the battle were courageous and very, very professional. It's a very rare case in ancient history, and perhaps in any history, of a woman commanding a fleet at sea. So Antony and Cleopatra flee. When the smoke is clears, they have maybe 90 ships that they go back to Egypt with. Octavian and Agrippa have destroyed most of their fleet. They've taken 140 warships. And this is a fleet that originally had 500 warships. All that's left is 90 ships. That's a disaster. The only card that Antony and Cleopatra have left to play is the Egyptian treasure. And they go back to Egypt, and Antony's kind of depressed, which is not terribly surprising. Cleopatra is still full of vim and vigor, and she is looking to her defenses, because they both know that a terrible thing is likely to happen, that Octavian is likely to pursue them. Let me just say before going on, this is a battle, a big, big battle, something like over 600 warships, probably over 200,000 men are involved in this battle in one capacity or another. And when it's over, well, we have a quotation from Augustus's memoirs. Those memoirs don't survive, but Augustus claims that he killed, that 5,000 men were killed in Antony and Cleopatra's fleet. He's a little nervous about admitting how large the losses were, because this is in effect a civil war. A later source says that's not true, that 12,000 men were killed in Antony and Cleopatra's fleet. 6,000 were wounded. And of those 6,000 wounded, another 1,000 succumbed to their wounds afterwards. So 13,000 men killed, and most of them were Romans killed in a civil war. It's not an easy propaganda thing for, not an easy publicity point for Octavian. Well, let me quickly bring to the story to the end. And here, by the way, is sunrise at Actium. I like to imagine Octavian the next morning, he spends the night at sea because he's not really sure he's won the battle. But the next morning he can see that he clearly has been successful. Antony and Cleopatra go back to Egypt. The next year, Octavian follows them there. And you all know the story from Shakespeare. Cleopatra negotiates with Octavian. She's willing to betray Antony to save her children. Antony commits suicide, and he dies in Cleopatra's arms, as in this marvelous early modern woodcut from the Netherlands. Octavian enters Alexandria. Cleopatra negotiates with him. We don't know exactly what was said, but my own guess is that Octavian said, if you are willing to leave the scene, Cleopatra, then I guarantee the safety of your 3 children by Antony, not her son by Caesar. He was too threatening to Octavian Caesar, and he unfortunately was executed. Cleopatra does leave the scene in one of the more famous scenes in Shakespeare. As you know, in Shakespeare, she has a snake smuggled into her palace, and he bites her and she dies of the poison. The herpetologists disagree as to whether a snake could have killed Cleopatra. And the ancient sources say they're not sure if she really was killed by a snake or if she was killed by taking poison. And there are even some scholars who deny that she committed suicide at all, and say that Octavian actually killed her and then spread the word that she committed suicide. I don't know. I have a little trouble believing something like that. I think she did have a grand exit. To bring the story to a rapid close, Octavian now annexes Egypt. It had been an independent country, and it now becomes a Roman province, which he personally controls. He's now the unquestioned ruler of the Roman world, with Antony gone. He makes his way slowly back to Rome, where he celebrates a great triumph and puts up a victory arch. It no longer stands, but here you can see it depicted on one of his coins. As for Cleopatra, she becomes a legend. She goes down into history. Her 3 children are actually brought to Rome. The boys never make it to adulthood, but her daughter, as you heard earlier, goes on to become an African queen, a very, very interesting character. As for Octavian, he becomes Rome's first emperor, the Emperor Augustus. And it's all because of the victory that he won at the Battle of Actium on September 2nd, 31 BC. Well, thank you. I'm going to end my presentation there, and I would be very happy to take any questions.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that. I think we all learned a little bit about Actium and Caesar Augustus, as he was known as in the Roman world. So
Yeah.
without further ado, don't forget you can ask questions at any time. There's a Q&A button there, so don't be shy, everyone. The first question for you is, have you heard of something called dead water? And do you think that had an effect on the ships of Cleopatra and Antony during the Battle of Actium?
Very good question. I have heard of dead water, and there are some scientists who think that it had an effect on Antony and Cleopatra. I'm not qualified to judge the scientific argument, but they base this on a report in the sources that says that Antony's ship was caught up in a sucker fish. The ancient Greek name of it is an echines. I think this is more likely, frankly, to be ancient propaganda against Antony, rather than to be an indication that his ship was immobilized. By saying that it was a sucker fish, it makes him look weak. It makes him look like, well, a sucker. So yeah, I don't think his ship was, I don't think his fleet was stopped by dead water. I think his fleet was stopped by the fact that they simply didn't have what it took to defeat Octavian and Agrippa.
Okay. Speaking of Mark Agrippa, that's the next question. We know a little bit, if people have read about antiquities, what happened to Caesar Augustus and, of course, the Pax Romana. What
Yes.
happened to Marcus Agrippa? What was his life afterwards? What did he do?
He had a great life afterwards. So, as I said, he was a boyhood friend of Octavian and became one of his indispensable, in many ways, his right-hand man. Octavian used him for political and diplomatic missions. I mentioned, for instance, his visit to Judea. But then Octavian uses him for dynastic purposes. So Octavian had one birth child, his daughter Julia, from his first wife, who he divorced and married the glamorous and beautiful Livia, who had been married to another Roman before. Octavian was not quite in the Roman nobility. He was descended from Caesar on his mother's side, but on his father's side, he came from more of a lesser family. So he always wanted to make it to the top ranks of Rome. And Livia was as blue-blooded and noble a Roman woman as you could possibly imagine. She had 2 sons from an earlier marriage, but she wasn't able to have children with Octavian. So Octavian had this one birth child, Julia, who he wants to have a dynasty through Julia. He marries her off to the son of his sister Octavia by her first marriage, not by Antony. But unfortunately, the son, named Marcellus, dies young. So he's got a problem. His solution to the problem is to get Agrippa to divorce his wife and instead to marry Julia. And it turns out to be a very fertile union. She has, I think, 5 children by Agrippa. So Agrippa gets to be Octavian's son-in-law, and he gets to father who they think will be Octavian's successor. Agrippa dies when he's not all that old, and he's out of the picture well before the story comes to an end. None of these children, none of the sons, 2 of the sons die before they reach adulthood. One of them, depending on who you believe, has rebelled against Augustus or is simply unqualified to rule. So he's sent into exile. And Augustus is succeeded not by any of his birth grandchildren, but rather by Livia's son, one of Livia's sons from her first marriage, whom Augustus has adopted and becomes the Emperor Tiberius.
Okay. So we have a question. A patron wants to know the current book that you're researching for,
Yes.
the Jewish people in the Roman Empire. Do you have any idea when that'll be out?
Yeah, maybe 2025. Not really sure.
Okay, that's a fair question. Everybody, including myself, are curious. So we have
Yeah.
another question about
Yeah.
Antony. He
Yes.
sometimes is considered the embodiment of the god Dionysus in the East.
Yes.
What can you
Yes.
tell us about that?
Yes. So, in this period of history, any self-respecting leader had to have a god on his side or to be the embodiment of a god. So Octavian, conveniently for Octavian, before Julius Caesar was assassinated, the Roman Senate had voted to deify him. Nothing ever happened. But after his assassination, Octavian makes sure that Caesar is indeed deified and a temple is built to him. That's very convenient because Octavian can now call himself the son of a god. He becomes Divi Filius, the son of a god. Antony has to compete with that. Now, part of Cleopatra's appeal is that she happens to be a goddess. She is the human embodiment of the goddess Isis, the chief goddess of Egypt, and also the goddess Aphrodite. And she says to Antony, if you join up with me, you will be my consort. You will be the god Dionysus, also known as Osiris in Egypt. So Antony portrays himself as Dionysus. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, isn't Dionysus the god of wine? It sounds like John Belushi in Animal House. Like why would anyone want to be the god Dionysus? Well, he is the god of wine, but he is also the god of Alexander the Great. And Dionysus was known as the god who conquered what the Greeks called Asia, which we would call probably Southwestern Asia or the Middle East. And in fact, all of Asia and all the way as far east as as India and Pakistan and India. So Dionysus is not just the god of wine, but he's the god of conquest of the East. And that's why it's very useful for Antony to portray himself this way. His opponents in Rome said, forget about the conquest side of Dionysus. Antony is a drunkard, and Dionysus represents the fact that you can't trust Antony. But there are many people who would have been impressed by Antony's association with Dionysus.
Okay, so you talked a little bit about Caesar, and of course,
Yeah.
we know unfortunately what happened to him. He was a
Yeah.
dictator for life. That is a bad name, but the transition to emperor, did that have a good ring to it, or why?
Well, great
know,
question. Great question. And very perceptive. So actually, after Caesar's death, the Senate votes to abolish the title of dictator. And the person who moved the motion was none other than Antony. When Octavian becomes the last man standing in Rome and the top dog in Rome, he knows that he can't call himself a dictator. He certainly can't call himself a rex or a king because Caesar was accused by his opponents of wanting to be a king. So what's the solution? He has two things. First of all, he has himself called princeps, which means first. This was not a title that really existed in Rome before, but he has people call him princeps. And the other thing is he has himself given an honorary title. And the honorary title is more or less the Latin equivalent of reverend. The Latin equivalent of reverend is Augustus. That's not his real name. That's a name, that's a title that he takes on. And it's meant to sidestep the awkward fact that the guy's basically the emperor. He never calls himself emperor. He's called imperator, but that's Latin for a victorious general. And he also makes sure that he has holds the office of consul, which is the chief executive of Rome, and tribune of the people, which is a more popular position. But he's doing everything he can to sidestep the fact that he's really the dictator and calling himself anything but that. He's very good at public relations.
So for our last question, people always like to know what to see in Rome and Italy. Can you visit where perhaps maybe Caesar Augustus was buried, or is that lost to time?
No, you can bet where he was buried was the mausoleum of Augustus is in Rome. And it's being renovated. The last I heard, it had not been open to the public yet, but perhaps it has been. But you can see it from the outside. It's worth seeing. And right next to it is absolutely a spectacular monument, one of the greatest ones in Rome. It's called the Altar of Augustan Peace, also known as the Areopagus. It was this magnificent marble carved altar, which had on it scenes of Augustus's family and also scenes of the gods. And it's in a beautiful modern art museum designed by the American architect Richard Meyer. So it's really, I really recommend seeing that in Rome. You can also see the site where Julius Caesar was assassinated, but I admit that you will have to use your imagination because there's not that much there to see, but it is very stirring. And of course, you can visit the Roman Forum, which is quite spectacular.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Strauss,
You're
for
welcome.
talking to us
You're
about your wonderful book about Actium. We're all looking for your next book. So
Thank you so
very
much.
much again. And thank
You're
you
very
for
welcome.
all of you to coming out, and have a good weekend.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.